Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Peterpodcast. I'm your host, reporter Taylor Clydesdale. With me this week is my editor-in-chief, Lois Tuffin, and with us today is MPP for Peterborough, Jeff Leal. We've got him on the show today, and he's going to be talking about minimum wage.
But there's some in society today that seem to begrudge people earning $28,000 a year and a minimum wage.
The reality is that some of the hours have been cut back because the employer isn't choosing to.
Well, we haven't seen that en masse, and look, there will be some transition.
And we've also got some questions from readers who are asking him about housing availability and protections for Peterborough's green spaces. So, hope you enjoy the show.
As an individual who's not very partisan at my core, because I've always believed in politics, we all have common ground. I think, unfortunately, we're now losing that common ground, which I think is a challenge to democracy as a whole. I always look at this from the perspective is I have to be slightly partisan for the 28 days in the campaign period, but once the campaign is over, I represent everyone to the very best of my ability.
You're pretty loyal to the party.
Well, I'm a Liberal Party candidate, and at heart, I'm a small L Liberal. I happen to believe that government has a great role to play, and government can help be the equalizer in society. And frankly, I've always believed that one of the great roles as a small L Liberal is that we strengthen the floors of everybody in society to give them an opportunity, same kind of opportunities that I had grown up.
Okay, so that leads to our key topics, doesn't it, Taylor?
Yeah, it does. So we got lots to discuss about, but you just came off from an all candidates debate.
I did indeed.
Yeah.
Only two candidates were there.
Oh, okay. So I guess it wasn't really as much of an all candidates debate.
Well, everybody makes their choices when and where they show up.
Okay, but we got a long list of topics to get into, but I think one of the ones that we want to talk about first is energy and hydro.
Absolutely.
I was talking to a businessman the other day, downtown business person, and he was mentioning that the hydro costs for him have doubled over the past few years, and it's become harder for him to maintain his business because of that. He says that when he first got into business, he felt like he had more control over his business, and now because of these rising costs such as minimum wage and rising hydro rates, control's being taken away from him. So what's your response to that?
Let's put the hydro file in perspective. Since 2003, we've invested $50 billion to renew both the transmission capacity and the generation capacity of the province of Ontario. You may recall back in 2003, I remember this very well, that there were diesel generators on the lawns of Queen's Park in Toronto generating electricity for the city of Toronto, because the city of Toronto have gone through both brownouts and blackouts because the system was in such a dilapidated condition. So we felt the responsibility to the people of the province of Ontario that we rebuild the system. And anytime you rebuild the system, I mean, you can, the easy political out is not doing anything to the system and just let it get on its last legs that we experienced in 2003. So we invested $50 billion to develop one of the most reliable generation and transmission entities in the world today. So $50 billion has to be paid for. Do you put all that $50 billion on the rate base, or do you put some of that cost on the tax base, because future generations will benefit from the investment that would happen today? And that's exactly what we did. As we put a lot of it on the rate base, understandably, there was an outrage with the cost of hydro going up. So we decided to put a plan in place that would be more reflective of the cost over subsequent generations. We reduced it by 25%, 8% when we took it off the HST, and the other 17% as lowering rates in the province of Ontario. I know, I look at our own hydro costs in our family. We have a modest home in Peterborough. I looked at our bill for the Peterborough Utility Service, $137 for the most recent month. Now, full disclosure, a lot of our electricity is used off-peak because there's nobody at home during the day. And it clearly showed that there's been a substantial discount in our electricity costs. Investments take money, and someone has to pay for it. And it would have been irresponsible of the government of Ontario not to renew both the generation side and the transmission side. So let's look on the generation side. $12 billion is being invested to do the renewal at Darlington. Jobs are directly related to Peterborough because BWXT, which is in the CANDU nuclear business, is very active on that file, creates jobs in this general area. We created the third tunnel at Beck in Niagara Falls to take advantage of the fall Niagara Falls, and that doesn't come cheap. And it's very interesting to me that the other political parties in the province of Ontario. So, well, we'll take your plan and do a little bit more. So, we had to do it, and it's a good investment to be made. There's no question.
Isn't one of the questions, though, that there's now an oversupply of hydro, and that's that we're having to sell it off more cheaply?
Well, let me address the oversupply. The reason we have an oversupply is on any given day in the province of Ontario, we need 14,500 megawatts of baseload power. We have two parts of our generation capacity in Ontario that you can't shut down. You got to run them full out all the time. You can't shut down the nuclear power station in Darlington. You can't tell Niagara Falls, well, oh my goodness, the water quit falling over Niagara Falls. You certainly can't do that. So you balance it, and we do this on a North American grid post free trade of 1988. So there's electricity movement back and forth across the board. Just to show you the North American tie line, remember when we had the blackout in 2003? That actually occurred in Ohio. So there was a malfunction in Ohio which impacted the province of Ontario. That goes to my point that electricity moves on a north-south axis, not an east-west axis. So there will be surplus movement on both sides of the border at any given time.
So, residents and, like this business person that I talked to, and not just business people, but, people who are just paying their rent and paying their hydro rates, they're looking at the province right now, and they're saying that, our hydro rates have gone up, and they're pointing the finger at the Liberal Party, especially with the sale of Hydro One, and saying that that's one of the reasons why their hydro rates have gone up. You seem like you have something to say on that.
Well, we've retained, when people say there was a sell-off, our approach to Hydro One was much different than the 407. The 407 was 100% sold off by the government of Mr. Harris in 1999. We retain 41% ownership of Hydro One. We didn't touch the generation side, just to go back a bit.
So it's less than half.
That is correct, but when the Harris government decided that they were going to privatize the whole gamut of electricity in the province of Ontario, they broke up the old Hydro One and created three new entities. Ontario Power Generation, that looked after their generation assets. Hydro One, which was the transmission, distribution, and billing. And the third one was Ontario Hydro Financial, that they were going to shift all the debt to make a possible sale of one or two much more palatable. We control 40%, and the proceeds that we generated from the sale were put back into the Ontario Trillium Trust, which has been used for infrastructure development right across the province of Ontario. A $30 billion program, $15 billion allocated to the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and $14 billion plus for outside of the Greater Toronto Hamilton area.
But does not having controlling share of Hydro One, not having that 51%, does that take away the power to control rates from the province?
No, remember, the rates in Ontario are set by the Ontario Energy Board, but Hydro One is only responsible for distribution and transmission and billing. It's OPG that actually generates the product that is going through the lines. And in fact, there's been some finger pointing at the management team at Hydro One. Mm-hmm. Well, under the current management team, they've brought in savings of about $114 million to that organization. Hydro One for a long time had terrible customer service. They've improved that dramatically, got rid of both the winter and summer cutoffs to people of low income, and consolidated their customer service to make it much more user friendly. And look, Hydro One and their service, they've done a pretty good job. I think there were some challenges over the weekend with the windstorm, limbs falling. Sometimes there's variables under their control. But I think there's been a number of articles written that Hydro One has become a much better entity under its current structure.
So what do you have to say to the parent who's on a single income, who is supporting a family, who they're struggling right now because they're dealing with these rising costs, and they're having to choose between affording their hydro rates and affording their rent and affording food for their family?
Well, I'll address it, and the premise of that question is, well, let's look at what we've done. We've increased the minimum wage for people in the province of Ontario, January 1st, 2018. Went to $14 an hour, January 1st, 2019. That will increase to $15 an hour. So I defy anybody. Is there anybody in Ontario society today that begrudges an individual? Because I grew up in the south end of Peterborough. Honest day's work, it's an honest day's pay. So who are we to begrudge somebody working 40 hours a week, $14 an hour, gross income of $28,000 a year? I'd like to see anybody that really begrudges, but there's some in society today that seem to begrudge people earning $28,000 a year
But the
and a
reality
minimum
is,
wage.
the reality is that some of the hours have been cut back because the employer isn't choosing to.
Well,
spend $14 an hour.
we haven't seen that en masse, and look, there will be some
we'll
transition. We've last fall we reduced the small business tax rate from 4.5% to 3.5%. The reality is, anybody that's done a detailed analysis knows that people with minimum wage often put all that back in to the economy. We also brought in the Ontario Child Benefit to support those families with children to meet financial obligations. And what's something dear to my heart is we brought in a tuition framework for those families 50,000 and under. Tuition's free, so the brightest and the best will never have financial barriers to get a post-secondary education in the province of Ontario. Just recently, of course, through my initiative as the Small Business Minister, we corrected a problem with the calculation of holiday pay, which for many small businesses was a greater issue than the minimum wage increase.
I told you when he got on the roll he would keep going. I warned Taylor about that.
But just to
Because I feel passionate about things.
Mm-hmm.
I understand.
But to dive into minimum wage, one of the elements of the minimum wage is the cost of a lot of things have risen since then. I know just going to the grocery store now, buying food is a little bit more expensive. Going out to a restaurant is a little bit more expensive. So the cost of minimum wage, the minimum wage itself has increased, and it's set to increase again in January. But the cost of everything else have kind of adjusted. Do you think that they've balanced out, or do you think?
There will always be issues, but fundamentally in my heart, I believe that everybody deserves a decent wage who's going to work. And if it's $28,000 a year, I think it's an excellent start. But fundamentally, in the fiber of my soul, $14 an hour, you got to pay people a decent wage.
Mm-hmm. But you might be paying them $14 an hour, which was a decent wage before, but if the cost of everything's increased and if hours are being cut back at some businesses, but maybe it's not en masse, maybe it is.
Okay, Tyler, let's put this in perspective. During the Tory years, from 1995 to 2003, when minimum wage was frozen for 8 long years, are you telling me that prices didn't go up during that time too?
I'm not too sure.
So what about OW and ODSP rates? Because those are individuals that again, the Harris froze those payments for a very long time.
Absolutely.
You've increased them.
We have increased them,
Slightly.
and in this current budget, we recognize those particular challenges. So on the next 3 fiscal cycles, they'll go up 3% each and every year. Plus, we've lifted up their income earnings without starting the clawback.
Right. Those people are particularly vulnerable.
They are indeed. Yep.
So,
I would challenge anybody. You check the inflation rate from 1995 to 2003. I can guarantee you it wasn't zero inflation during that period of time.
So just going into 2018, 2019,
Sure.
What are the measures that are going to be taken to help out these businesses who do say that they are struggling?
And the backdrop of all this, contrary to what people may see, I mean, there's some people that want to go around the province of Ontario and convince everybody that we're in a depression. So let's look at the macroeconomic numbers. The unemployment rate in the province of Ontario, 5.5%, at the lowest it's been in 17 years. And if you equate that from 2014, that's 500 new jobs each and every day being created in the province of Ontario by our dynamic private sector.
Are they full-time jobs, do we know? Or
the majority of them are full-time jobs.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, but sorry to get back to the
Didn't mean to
question.
digress.
Oh, no worries. But for the businesses that are struggling, what can we expect, in the future to help
Two
accommodate
things.
those businesses?
Two things we did is we reduced the small business tax rate from 4.5 to 3.5%. And one of the issues that was brought to my attention was the calculation of holiday pay, which I said previously for some was a greater irritant than the minimum wage increase. And I'll let you, particularly in areas where you may be involved in the tourism sector, you have an individual that might be working 3 part-time jobs. So under the new scheme that they proposed, a person in that situation, under the new calculation, was getting more holiday pay than somebody that was working full-time 5 days a week. That was just wrong. So we went back to the old way of doing things, which will reduce the small business, and that will be enacted for Canada Day.
Okay. I think that's a good place for us to take a short break. So we're
Sure.
gonna take a couple minutes. I'm gonna grab a glass of water, and then we'll be right back.
Thank you.
We're back on the Peter Podcast, and we've got some questions here from Twitter, from some citizens here in Peterborough that are interested to hear what your thoughts are on a couple of issues. So here's one. What can be done to assist with quality affordable housing? And then in brackets, not someone's dodgy basement apartment that's been turned into a rooming house. So what are your thoughts on affordable housing?
Well, just recently, Province of Ontario has entered into a framework agreement with the Government of Canada. I believe the flow to Ontario over the length of that agreement would be about $545 million. That'll allow communities right across the province of Ontario to embark in construction and partnership with entities. We've done Peterborough's done a lot of interesting things. We have the Mount Project. I talked to some people just a week or so ago from Shared Dreams, and that's very promising for them. So there's all kinds of potential partnerships. And one of the challenges that we had in Peterborough back in 2004, July 15, 2004 is when we had the flood. And I know there's a lot of people that didn't appreciate we lost a lot of affordable housing because of damage from the flood, and a lot of that was never replaced for a whole number of reasons. So we had to address that inventory.
We were already in a crunch.
Yeah, we were.
5 years earlier, and we've been named Ontario's homelessness capital.
Yeah, and we lost some very valuable inventory and housing stock for that. And gradually, we've partnered with entities to rebuild it. More always needs to be done. And we just announced one of 13 municipalities across Ontario, $2 million in a rent or rebate program that will encourage hopefully some private sector entities to partner with the city, because the money's transferred to the city to provide some more affordable units. So
a lot of this is related to supply, because obviously there's been a real estate crunch lately, and so some of the people that are selling are eating up some of the rental income. So what is, outside of affordable housing, is there something that being done to address the supply of all levels of housing?
Well, the city of Peterborough, county of Peterborough, remains a very viable housing market. And I guess this is one of the challenges when you have a major transportation corridor like the 407 moving east. By the way, that was something the Chamber asked for. Every mayor of the city of Peterborough has asked for. Every warden of Peterborough County has asked for. Every development agency in this area asked for that to be accomplished, and we have. But what it's meant is, I just talked to an individual before Christmas. He made a decision, him and his wife, 2 young professionals, to move to the Peterborough. They actually moved into Keene, and they did so because of access to the 407. So, that's going to put pressure, and that's a good thing in terms of confidence in a local economy. But the other part of that equation is the need to look at many more housing models that potentially the province, along with the federal government, can be partnered to.
Yeah, and I know in terms of housing supply, one of the things that the city has struggled with is one of the provincial the Places to Grow Act. The gist of it seems to be that they're aiming for municipalities to kind of build upwards, not outwards, more or less. And the city has kind of been struggling with that, and they're looking at those growth targets in kind of urban central areas, and they're saying it's very difficult to meet those targets.
Well, infrastructure is very expensive. And having been on the municipal side of this equation for 18 years, I've always believed that you try to make maximum use of every dollar that you put into the ground or every street and transportation corridor that you provide. And one of the ways that you can do that is to maximize targets that you receive to reflect those densities. One of the things that former Premier McGuinty did was to bring in the Greenbelt. Well, there was some talk about the Greenbelt inhibiting the building new housing. That's just completely false. There's a lot of areas that were designated under the White Belt that would accommodate housing development. And of course, from my perspective, I was rather sad to see that there's some political entities in Ontario today that were going to sell it off to billionaire developers. And that would have occurred if that video hadn't surfaced. What a sad thing, because the Greenbelt contains the last of the remaining Class 1 and 2 soils in the province of Ontario, our most productive soils, and those kind of things are never for sale.
Some of those municipalities are feeling, though, there is a possibility to grow, that their growth is being restricted.
Well, my answer to that is there's a broad base called the White Belt in the province of Ontario, in those areas, that would accommodate a lot of that housing growth without destroying the Greenbelt. And there's studies that have been done by very reputable organizations identifying the number of acres that are available under the White Belt for possible housing construction. Imagine what it would have been from an infrastructure perspective to destroy the Greenbelt in the province of Ontario. I always like to give credit where credit is due. In 1973, when Mr. Davis was Premier of the province of Ontario, he brought in the Niagara Escarpment Commission and the Environmental Assessment Act, because if Mr. Davis hadn't brought in the Niagara Escarpment Commission, there would have been no VQA wine industry in the province of Ontario, because every inch would have been paved over in the Niagara Peninsula by today. That's a fact.
Do you want to talk about EAs? Do you want to talk about the Parkway?
Actually, I have a question here about the Parkway. Because, we've just been talking about environmentalism and environmental protections. I have a question here. I'd like to know what the candidates will do to protect green spaces in the area. How will they respond to issues such as the Parkway extension, which will ultimately destroy the beauty of Jackson Park?
Well, first of all, Mr. Davis was a very, very wise person back in 1973. And the reason he brought in the Environmental Assessment Act in the province of Ontario in 73, because one of the first acts as Premier he did in 1971 was to cancel the Spadina Expressway. The Spadina Expressway was a little like the Parkway, and Mr. Davis could see a 6-lane highway going through the middle of Toronto and destroying a lot of green space, and he thought that was inappropriate. So he canceled that and then brought in the Environmental Assessment Act. All road projects, whether municipal or provincial road projects, are come under the auspices of the Environmental Assessment Act, and I think we want to make sure that we have provisions in place to protect the environment as we look at possible alternatives. So there some question, but I always reflect on my municipal career, because I've always said that if you're not for something, you have to have a viable alternative. So in the 90s, there was a group of us. We were called the TE5 on Peterborough City Council. It was transportation and the environment. We were advocates of taking the Parkway up to Park Hill Road, never going north of that because of the bridge in the other area. 4-lane Brayley Drive from top to bottom out to Atkinson Road. And thirdly, create a transportation corridor along the Hydro Corridor north of Trent University. The reason we looked at that was because there's sterile lands anyways, and there was sufficient road width, and it's done throughout Ontario, to put a road network next to a hydro corridor because of the sterile zone of a hydro corridor. So I always believe you have to have an alternative if you're not supportive of something, and the Parkway, from my perspective, has always been controversial north of Park Hill Road and remains that case.
Well, going back to the provincial aspect of it, it's gone back to the province's hands, right? We're going to have to figure out what's going to happen with that roadway.
And we've there's been opportunities for the city to meet with MOCC And OECC has always been very cooperative, that they work with the city to develop the terms of reference. And it's interesting, in a letter that Minister Ballard had sent back to the city a number of months ago, he actually put a chronology of dates in that letter. I don't know whether any members of council shared that with you, but when you look at that, consistently through the whole letter, is that we've reached out to the city of Peterborough. We want to work with the city of Peterborough, and if terms of reference had developed some time ago, the EA would have been done by now, with the alternatives put on the table.
But the terms of reference, the city's engineering staff has met all the criteria that the ministry set. And politically, we are now at a standstill. So it's a political issue. It's not a...
Yeah, the Ministry of the Environment is still open to develop the terms of reference. And it's interesting, when you look at the chronology of contacts, there was a full year when there was no contact between the city and MOECC.
So it's politics.
Well, we continue to have an environmental assessment process in the province of Ontario.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to move on to our kind of last Twitter question here. If I can just go up a little bit. And this is something that obviously you're involved with because you're our Minister of Agriculture.
Yes.
So I have a question here. I would like to know how the candidates are going to help rural communities in Peterborough County. Aging infrastructure, increasing provincial reporting requirements, and downloading is burdening residents. There's only one taxpayer at the end of the day.
Well, that's a great question because we're the party and government of uploading. I remember those sad days because I was a member of City Council between 1995 and 2003 when the download took place. They had a committee. It was called the Who Does What Committee. And many of us that were in municipal politics renamed that was the Who Got Done In Committee. And that was municipalities right across the province of Ontario. They downloaded all the cost drivers to municipalities. Social housing, social welfare cost, land ambulance. And over the last decade, between 2008 and 2018, we've uploaded a lot of those costs. I think the city of Peterborough, our upload to the city of Peterborough is about $24 million over that period. 43% of all the roads and bridges were downloaded in Eastern Ontario. That infrastructure was put in place between 1945 and 1955. And we developed several programs, OCIF, the Ontario Community Infrastructure Program, specifically targeted for communities 100,000 and under in the province of Ontario, and many of the rural municipalities, Peterborough County took advantage of that.
So farmers here in Peterborough County, and the county isn't an exception, but they faced 2 years of bad weather, which has made it very difficult for them.
Yep.
Last year we had rain, which caused a lot of damage to farmers' fields. The year before that we had a terrible drought, which also caused damage to farmers' fields. So we're kind of in a critical point right now where if we have another bad year for farmers, they're looking at their incomes and they're saying we might be in trouble. Yeah, so what is available to help out farmers who, if we do have a third bad year, they're looking at their pocketbooks.
Well, you're quite
and our food supply.
Yeah.
You're quite right. In the summer of 2016, there was a regional drought that hit 5 counties across the province of Ontario. Peterborough County was one of them. And then in 2017, we had excessive rainfall. But thank goodness, Mother Nature corrected itself. We had a very warm September with lots of sunshine. So the yields both on corn and soybean at the end of the day turned out quite well. Here in the province of Ontario, we have a standalone $100 million risk management program that we administer. Plus, we have business risk management programs that we share with the Government of Canada on a 60-40 basis. And most of the farmers, of course, enroll in these programs. One of the things I did when I became minister, I made sure that AgriCorp, which is the provincial entity that does crop assessment and then pays out the relevant insurance premiums, would work as effectively as possible. And during those 2 years, whether it was the summer 2016, I had the AgriCorp people out in the fields to ascertain the damage due to drought, and then in 2017, damage due to wet weather.
So I guess one of the last things I want to talk about is just looking at kind of the small scale here in Peterborough, and then looking at the large scale in the province right now. Because right now Kathleen Wynne is, a lot of people are looking at Kathleen Wynne and saying that they're kind of fatigued by her policies, and they're not exactly in supporting of her. And there's right now the PCs are in the lead in the polls. Do you think that's going to affect how people vote here in Peterborough?
Well, look, I have profound respect of whatever the outcome is on June the 7th. You talk about fatigue. If history serves me correctly, the Progressive Conservatives were in power in Ontario for 42 straight years, 1943 to 1985. That was a long run.
Ago.
Yeah, long run. But I'm a bit of a historian, so I like to put everything
Yeah, you haven't mentioned Reagan once today.
in context. Look, as a government, I mean, we have kept renewing our policy base. You look at things that full day kindergarten, JKSK, which is interesting enough. Barack Obama's education secretary, Arne Duncan, came to Ontario 5 times to see what we're doing in our public education system. He didn't choose to go to Quebec or British Columbia. He wanted to come to Ontario because Ontario is a leader when it comes to public education. You look at what we're doing, unprecedented investments in infrastructure, changes we're making to daycare in the province of Ontario. I can tell you from one of the great things we brought in, OHIP Plus, free prescriptions for $2,500. My wife's an elementary principal at St. Patrick's here in Peterborough. The Catholic Board has a policy, good policy, for those people that suffer from anaphylactic shock due to a bee sting, that you have to have 2 EpiPens at school. Those are $200. So we're covering those kind of costs, which allow families to allocate other resources to other priorities within the family.
But the taxpayers
So
are paying for that.
we continue to have a very I think aggressive policy mix, and that allows us to keep renewing ourselves in the province of Ontario.
But what do you think of your chances right now? Are you confident? Are you worried?
I'll be out working every day. Look, I've had the great privilege of being in public life in this community for 33 straight years. It's a privilege that I remind myself each and every day, and it's a privilege I have to work every day to retain.
Yeah, you like to campaign. We'll see how things turn out on June 7th.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to add?
Nope.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good.
And to everyone else, we will see you next week in our continued Peter Podcast election coverage.
Good.